closing remarks, and we'll be done with day one. Thoughts or questions for any of our authors, please.
If you're awake.
Please. How about back there at the blue table and then up here at the yellow table? Gold.
Thanks. Hi. I have a question for Simone about the gender paper. So what were you expecting or hoping that women or anybody would be doing with the smartphones? And was the smartphone ownership meant to be linked to other types of, you know, productive activities or income generation activities explicitly? Or do you have any sense of like what they would have used it for?
I see. I think it's just like a question of the theory of change for like in this setting, what do we think women would be using phones for? I mean, I think like it's sort of the usual story. I can tell you what we measured. So, you know, definitely income generation, and, you know, kind of both self-employment and just broader participation in the labor markets. We don't see kind of any impacts there, which, you know, I think my prior is you might see something somewhat different in a setting like sub-Saharan Africa, where women's labor force participation is perhaps a bit higher. You know, so networks and mental health, you know, women in these settings are often very socially isolated, and just like kind of that well-being effect. That's really where we see action. We kind of asked about use of digital financial services. You know, I mean, especially India has, I think, a tremendous success story in the ways that they have invested in their digital infrastructure. And, you know, if you go to these rural communities, there's actually a really, really large set of, for example, like digital payment options on offer, or, you know, ways that you can use your smartphone to access Aadhaar linked bank accounts, and ways that you can, you know, make payments. And what we see is that, you know, I think 25-30% of men in these rural areas are doing this stuff, and it's just like no women are doing it. And we don't see, you know, I think the training does increase this a little bit from a low base. So I think, and then in terms of Sky, we're also interested in just broader, like local economic activity. You know, what's the effect of bringing an entire community online? So we tried to cast, and then there are also, I think, things around misinformation and COVID and the Sky evaluation, given the timing of everything. So we tried to, I think, cast a relatively broad net, kind of guided by previous literature. And then the use case that I didn't tell you about was sort of focused on health, and we measure, you know, kind of knowledge in terms of the information we're sharing through the phone.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. And I'm sorry we have to go through so quickly through the questions, please.
Yes, I have two questions. Maybe they are short, but you mentioned that they gave the phone with like full access to data for like 6 months. So my question is like, what happened afterwards? And then the other thing that I understood that you were saying that the literary training was digital literacy training was for women only. But so I thought that would be for both genders. So why men don't need that?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the data, I think they got about 1 to 2 gigs per month for 12 months. After that, it ran out. Data is actually quite cheap in India relative to other low-income settings. I think we did ask in the survey how much people are spending per month on data. I can't recall, but I could answer that question in follow-up. In terms of why focus on women, I think there's a lot of reasons, like kind of situating. Like women are very socioeconomically marginalized, and, you know, there's often sometimes like an emphasis on like separating the sexes. And India also has like a massive national infrastructure, which is about creating women's groups. And so this notion of training women in groups is a way of, you know, targeted gender empowerment. I think it's very natural in this setting, and that's the way that we approached it. You know, we're certainly interested to see if there was knowledge transfer within the household. You know, we see the training actually doesn't have any effect on phone use among men who already know how to do more tasks. So, you know, in that sense, I think it did make sense as a strategy. You know, I think we very much approached this kind of with this desire to help close gender gaps by focusing on the most marginalized.
Benefits, which I'm sure they would. It's a good question. There was a question back here in the corner, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Emily. I remember that you mentioned with higher access to digital payment and digital engagement, it will increase younger employees' deposit and balance, right? And I wonder if it's also related to the outside payment environments, because I have some experience in other countries. I noticed that, for example, in China, if young people, they moved from rural areas to big city and open digital accounts, and actually it's increased their risk to fall in debts because it's too convenient for them to buy like everything. So I'm not sure if you like have conduct similar experiments in different countries, like with different outside factors. Thank you.
Yeah, in this context, they don't really have access to credit. The bank account isn't a sustainable channel to get access to bank loans. And at that point in the digital payment infrastructure, there wasn't anything kind of added on top of that. So there were limited opportunities for them to get into debt. We did work with our partner bank to try to think about it like a term loan product, that since they were at the firm, they had now are establishing a track record. We wanted to avoid something that looked like a payday loan. So that's why we picked kind of a term loan, and there was just very, very little demand for it. So we ended up scrapping it. But this is not an ecosystem where there's a huge consumer credit market at that time. And so we haven't thought about other contexts.
Thanks for that. So you know who they are. We're out of time. I'll call the end on the call, the Q&A, but you know who our wonderful authors are. Please contact them, this evening or tomorrow. Just a few closing remarks. Many of you could do a better job on closing remarks than I could here. I'm going to offer just 3 quick thoughts, and in part they're based on some of the stuff that I'm more involved in. So I didn't mention this, but my current role on the Berkeley campus is I oversee innovation and entrepreneurship. So the tech transfer, the patenting, the licensing, the accelerators, that's kind of my lens, okay? So I just thought I should say that because I think it's relevant for what I'm about to say. But so here's point number 1. When we think about the mission of any of our universities, this one included, I think, certainly 20 years ago, we would often hear people talk about, well, it is research and it's teaching and it's public service. And those are very, very important elements of what we do. I don't know how many of you have seen Simon Sinek's work, or there are lots of people that are sort of work in this direction, but it sort of start with why. I mean, what is the why? And our research, teaching, and public service, as profoundly important as they are they the deep why? I mean, a mission statement is the why. And if you look at a lot of our universities and you actually parse the mission statements, and I think appropriately so, you will get to a phrase like long-term societal benefit. And it might sound like, we're talking at the 30,000-foot level here, but if you thought about the kind of research that you are doing or you're interested in, or for those of you that are policymakers, or for those of you that are in industry, for universities, the difference between talking about, if you thought about innovation and entrepreneurship, which isn't, the main focus of what you're talking about, if you really said the mission of Berkeley or any of our universities is research, teaching, and service, then you would look at innovation and entrepreneurship and say, you're way out on the periphery, friend. You're not like core to what this institution is doing. But if you talk about long-term societal impact as the core, well, then innovation and entrepreneurship is not the only way you deliver on that, but it's part of it. And I want to, the papers that were just presented, but the whole theme of this conference, I think, is this idea that as universities start to think about, look, basic research, essential. Curiosity-driven research, essential. These institutions that we're part of, among society's most valuable assets. And at the same time, I think we're thinking more and more deeply about how do we get more impact out of the great research that we're doing. And I just wanted to connect what you're doing here to the mission of universities, okay? So that's my point 1. Point 2 is related to point 1. And many of you do this stuff, so you know exactly what it looks like at your university. But at Berkeley, I've been going to some events around a community of scholars on the Berkeley campus around the theme of community engaged scholarship. Now, I think I don't know if it's the term of art that every university uses. It's become a kind of clarion call on this campus. And an awful lot of our colleagues can see their work through that phrase. And it is hard to look at those 4 wonderful papers and think that this is anything but community engaged scholarship, right? It's rigorous. There are RCTs all over it. But the idea is, look, we need to design the right experiments. We need to get deeper into it. We need to involve communities in the way that we do this. And now, at some level, you could say, okay, well, but literally, so my job is in the Vice Chancellor for Research Office, right? So I kind of see what's coming in over the transom. What are the self-organizing research areas that are popping up at Berkeley? And a woman by the name of Emily Ozer, I don't know if you know that name, Ozer, but you should look her up. She and many other people are organizing this community-engaged scholarship. I'm going to call it a community or a movement, but it's for real, right? And so the provost of this university has sort of called it out and said, how far could we take this? Of course, the usual questions of what kind of resources are going to be brought to bear. But I'll give you one very concrete element, and we're happy to share this, obviously, as a university. But the community engaged scholarship, if you don't mind my calling it a movement, I don't mean to take away from its substance. It's incredibly substantive. But one of the things that they did is we have a tenure process that's pretty centralized at the end of the day at Berkeley. And there's a committee that ultimately makes the decisions. And it's a quite centralized committee. They laid out some standards for tenure and promotion for people who are doing community engaged scholarship, because people felt like those of us that are doing the kind of work that you're doing, for those of you that are academics, it's like that centralized process wasn't understanding how to evaluate the best work. Happy to share what those standards look like, but the idea is we need to make room for the kind of research that is having the most impact, and the kind of research that you've been talking about here today is obviously part of that. So that's point 2, this community engaged scholarship and the different kind of manifestations that it has at different universities. Here's my third and last point, and then we'll get you out of here by 5:30. So part of it is, look, you've thought a lot about this. From my perspective, it's a jargon word, scaling. How do we scale? How do we get this stuff done at scale? And you've all thought a lot about this, right? So when I'm thinking about payroll accounts, it's sort of like, yeah, is the private sector going to do this on their own? How much does public policy need to change? I mean, these are absolutely terrific experiments. And when we start to think about the kind of constellations of incentives that are going to get not just the private sector, but the private and the public sector to line up and get these things to happen. And so I think that's one of the things that as we ultimately think about what's working and how to scale it, those are some of the super hard questions. They're the same kinds of questions that we're dealing with regularly on this campus. How do we scale stuff that's working using incentives that really aren't there right now? And ultimately, where are they going to come in? So those of you that are policymakers and industry side of things, it's sort of like, well, would payroll accounts, just to take an example, is this the kind of thing that we would expect to be an endogenous outcome? Or is it really not very realistic to think of some of this stuff as an endogenous outcome without some pretty fundamental changes in incentives? And that's what you guys think about. So I'm not saying anything you haven't thought about, but at the end of the day, we need to scale it if we're going to get the big benefits from all this work. So I'm gonna stop there. I don't know if I turn it back to the organizers or just call the day complete. Day 1 down. Well done, everybody. Thank you.